Thank you so much, Trevor, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today. I hope we have our full contingent. We were so excited. We saw almost 59 or 60 people join today for today's session. So let's hope that they come in as we go on. It's a very exciting process for the Coalition for Organizational Integrity, because we are starting the first of a series of masterclasses today. And the first one, I think, deals with probably one of the most important aspects of ethics in organizations, and that is understanding the code of ethics. So this first series of the masterclass will deal in three parts, with understanding the code, then drafting the code, and then the third series will deal with in implementing the code. So we've got a lot to get through, and I'm not going to take too long. Before we begin the class, I would like to just echo what Trevor said. If you could please use the Q&A for your questions and not the discussion, because I'm not going to have time to look at the discussion and I might miss your important questions. So please do use the Q&A. How are we going to do this? And I'm just going to share the screen at this stage to show you exactly what our program is. What we will do is we will deal in three parts in this session: an introduction to ethics, what is a code of ethics, and then why do we need them in our organizations. And today we're very, very privileged to have two real experts in this area to join us. And the first is Hendro Navene, who is a chartered accountant and a consultant and technical director at OCAM. And he has written many articles, scientific articles. He's produced the Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants in Mozambique, which has been quite a groundbreaking piece of work. And he's a senior consultant for national and international organizations such as the World Bank and the Pan-African Federation of Accountants. And he has extensive accounting and finance experience. He's a trained facilitator and a lecturer. And he has an MSc in international business from the University of Lincoln. And he's also a certified ethics officer. Welcome to you, Hendro. And then we're delighted to have Fatima Rawat, who's an associate with the Ethics Institute. And I just want to make a note. This is not an Ethics Institute discussion. It's a coalition discussion. But we're supported by the Ethics Institute, which we're delighted about because the expertise is phenomenal. So both Hendro and Fatima have done a lot of work with the Ethics Institute. Fatima has had some very exciting work in the Gauteng Municipal Integrity Project, which focuses on supporting the Gauteng municipalities to enhance their integrity management. She is a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Law and a Master's in Management graduate from the University of the Witwatersrand. And she has a certificate in legislative drafting and compliance management from the University of Johannesburg. She's an admitted attorney in the High Court and also a certified ethics officer. And I was very privileged to have had her input into my process in becoming a certified ethics officer. Thank you so much. She has extensive experience in the field of the public sector and as official and as a management consultant, and has a keen interest in governance ethics and integrity management, anti-corruption compliance and regulation. Welcome, Fatima. Just before we would begin, I would like to say to you, we've got a very exciting happening towards the end of the session today, where we will introduce the Portuguese version of the Code of Ethics Handbook. And this will be added to the Coalition website. And we hope that this will start some great momentum for our practitioners in Mozambique to have access to these really valuable resources in Portuguese. Now to the masterclass. So to begin, we cross to Fatima and to her presentation and to Hendro's input on that, which is an introduction to ethics.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. It's our privilege as the Ethics Institute to have the opportunity to engage with you. In our session today, as Barbara has outlined, we'd like to cover 3 issues which we'll manage in blocks. The first thing when we talk about code of ethics is for us to start by understanding what do we mean when we talk about ethics, and then we'll move on to talk about what is a code of ethics, and then lastly, why do we need a code of ethics in our organizations? So to get us started, I'd like to get a sense from you. When you hear the word ethics, what does it spring to mind? What do you think of? If we can run the poll, Trevor, when you think about ethics, what does it mean to you? Excellent, fantastic. Thank you very much for engaging in the poll. And that's really good feedback to get us going. So to get us into the understanding of what is ethics, I'd like to share with you a video from the Ethics Institute Business Ethics series, which unpacks what is the definition of ethics. And in its simplest form, I'd like you to please watch this video to get a sense of how we define the word ethics.
When you hear the words ethics or morality, what are the first things that come to mind? You probably thought of words such as good and bad, right and wrong, values, justice, norms, standards, integrity, honesty, fairness, respect, accountability, transparency, laws, policies, for the greater good, and many more. These are all words that we are familiar with and sometimes use when we communicate in our work situations, and they all relate to ethics. Allow us to now provide you with a basic and easy to remember definition of ethics. Ethics is concerned with that which is good for the self and for the other. As we can see from the triangle, the 3 concepts, good, self, and other, form the basis of a definition of ethics. The self could be an individual, a group, or an organization. So could the other be either an individual, a group, or an organization. Should one only do what is good for oneself, one could alienate the other and be regarded as selfish, which is the opposite of being ethical. On the other hand, by only doing what is good for the other, one neglects oneself in decisions and actions. For those of you who thought that ethics is only about doing what is good for others, in a kind of self-sacrifice, this should be good news. Ethics is also about considering what is good for oneself.
This triangle is very core to our definition of what we consider to be ethics. So ethics is really about that balance. It's about the balance of doing what is good both for the self and for the other. And I was very pleased to see the results of the poll where the majority of you are seeing ethics in this way. And this concept of ethics is very critical to our conversation today. But linked to the concept of ethics is also the notion of values. And it's one of the central concepts that we consider when we contemplate what ethics is. And when we think about what are values, values are defined as our convictions about what is good, what is important, or what is desirable. So you may see my conduct, it's evidenced in terms of what I do, but my values are what sits underneath me. They are what I believe to be good or what I believe to be important or desirable and propels my action or my conduct. And in the concept of organizations, we can then think about organizational values in the sense of what an organization thinks it's important, in terms of its strategic values, its work values, how people work with each other, and its ethical values in terms of what the organization thinks to be good. So when we think about the concept of ethics, one needs to also think about the concept of values because the two are very centrally linked. Now, if we take this general concept of ethics and we apply it to the concept of organizations, we take guidance from the King Code of Corporate Governance. So in the South African context, we have King 4, which provides us with a good corporate governance guide in terms of the key elements for good corporate governance in South Africa. And the tone of King 4 is centrally around ethics and ethical leadership. And King 4 provides us with the definition of organizational ethics. So it takes that concept of the triangle and it applies it in the context of organizations, and it provides as follows. It says that in the concept of organizations, Ethics refers to ethical values, and if you think back to the triangle, that would be the good, applied to decision-making, conduct, and the relationship between the organization, and back to the triangle, that would be the self, its stakeholders, and broader society, and that would be the other. So the central definition of ethics, even though it has a broad definition, is brought together in the context of organizations through this definition. And once again, what King is reminding us is those lovely values that we have that sit on our receptions areas when we walk in on our website. It's not just about having them visible. It's about applying those values to how we make decisions, to how we conduct ourselves as organizations, and the relationships that we have as an organization with our stakeholders, both internally and externally, as well as the impact that we have as organizations on broader society. So that gives us a broad definition of the concept of ethics. Barbara, I'll pause here for Hendro to come in. Hendro, would you like to add anything further?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Thank you very much, Barbara, for the opportunity. And thank you, the coalition, once again, for providing us this opportunity for sharing our particular experience. First of all, I would like to thank Fatima for the wonderful presentation. I think the presentation was very clear and thoughtful and understanding. What I would like to add is in Mozambique so far, we have various types of codes of ethics, but the one that we usually highlight is the code of ethics that was developed by the Institute of Directors, Instituto de Diretores de Moçambique. Thankfully, Mr. David Say, who is the CEO of the Instituto de Ethics, is in this particular session. So perhaps he could share with us some insights about this particular code. So basically, this is the basic code that we use when we want to create codes for other private institutions. Regarding the public sector, there are certain laws that somehow emphasize the ethical needs in the public sector. However, there is some room for improvement, and there are several projects that we're working with the government in order to have a particular document that emphasizes the ethical practices within the public sector. On the other end, as it was mentioned before, I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants and Registered Auditors of Mozambique, and we also have a code of ethics that will give a bit of understanding in the next sessions. But what I would like to emphasize is the ethics, as Fatima was saying, is particularly very important, especially the concepts. And we, in the code of ethics of the Institute of Directors and in the code of ethics of OCOM, that is thoroughly explained. And basically the concept is the same. The triangle is particularly important. However, the application usually varies, and we will give that emphasis in the next session. Thank you very much, Fatima.
Now that we've understood what ethics is, the next thing that we need to understand is what then is a code of ethics. So in its simplest definition, what do we mean by the word code? And a code is commonly described as a document that sets out a set of rules or a set of principles that governs a society or a community or a group of people. And if we go back to this definition of ethics as depicted in the triangle, when we think about the code, and we put the two words together, code and ethics, a code of ethics then symbolizes or signifies or codifies, puts into word that which is good for, if we put it in an organizational context. And what it then does is it writes down what that good is, and it guides the self in terms of its interaction with others. So again, I come back to the triangle because it's so central to our definition, not only about ethics, but about us understanding the broader aspects related to ethics. So if we think about the concept of a code of ethics, that code, as I've mentioned, represents or codifies what is good. So we say that a code is much like the constitution of an organization. what it does is it sets the ethical standards beyond the law. It says, what is it that in our organization represents that good? And it's not about compliance. It's about putting out there, what does it look like in our organization? And generally, if one has to engage with codes of ethics, you would find that in the tone and in the language, that a code it tends to be expressed in terms typically of statements of strategic ethical intent. So this is who we are, this is what we value, this is our moral compass. It's generally also expressed in terms of values, so this is what we stand for, and it would tend to, in some instances, unpack those values through illustration by way of conduct. So if I mean a value like honesty, what does the conduct look like? And generally, if one had to find codes of ethics, that's how you would find expression for a code of ethics. Now, going back to the King Code of Corporate Governance, and as I've mentioned, King 4 places a lot of emphasis on ethics and ethical leadership and the role of leadership in providing support and guidance to ethics management within our organizations. And King says that the governing body should ensure that codes of conduct and ethics policies address the key ethical risks of the organization. So it places a responsibility firmly on the doorstep of the governing body, and when one reads King, one needs to read it coupled with the responsibilities around ethical leadership in terms of both the governance of ethics and the ethics of governance. And it goes on to say that the governing body should approve codes of conduct and ethics policies that articulate and give effect to its direction on organizational ethics. And the tone in King 4 is around the role of governing bodies in terms of being able to set the tone for ethics within the organization. So it places this responsibility in terms of approval of codes of conduct and ethics policies squarely on the doorstep of governing bodies, although it would require the ethics office to be the custodian of the drafting and conceptualization of codes of ethics. Now, often in our language, we tend to use the word code of ethics and code of conduct almost interchangeably. So I'd like to ask you a question. Trevor, if we can please run the second poll. Is there a difference between a code of ethics and a code of conduct? I'd like to get a sense from you around what you think. Okay, excellent. That's great. That's a good representation for us for our next conversation. So 76% of you is saying, yes, there's a difference. 12% is saying, I know, and 12% is saying, I don't know. Thanks for that, Trevor. So let us take this conversation one step further. In our work, we say that there is a distinction between a code of ethics and a code of conduct. A code of ethics, if we think about the intent of a code of ethics, as I've explained using the concept of the triangle and explaining the definition of ethics and a code, what a code of ethics does is it sets out our constitution, our sense of what we as an organization think is good or right for our organization. So the way in which we write a code of ethics, the intent of the code of ethics is an aspirational document. It really is about who are we, what are we about, what is the sort of organization, and it is aimed at getting your organization to all move towards the same intent or aspire to the same value set, as opposed to a code of conduct. A code of conduct tends to be really one-directional. A code of conduct in its nature says, this is what is acceptable and this is what is not acceptable within our organization. So the intent of a code of conduct is really about telling our employees what will happen if they don't abide by the expected behaviors or conduct that is tolerable within our organization. So they speak two very different languages because the focus on a code of ethics is really primarily on our values. Who are we? What are we about? And you go back to thinking about what we've shared around King. It's really about centering itself on our value set as opposed to our code of conduct. where the primary focus in a code of conduct is about our behavior. And if you think back to your own organizations, codes of conducts that typically would be attached to employees' conditions of service, or that would be found as code of conduct documents, are really saying this is what is acceptable. If you do not behave, if you steal, if you lie, if you commit fraud, these are the consequences of what's going to happen. So the code of ethics is really about the spirit of the law, as opposed to the code of conduct, which is about the letter of the law. It's very compliance orientated, whereas the code of ethics is really about who are we, what are we about, what are our values, and it really is intended to get the collective buy-in of your organization so that we move towards achieving that purpose. So again, if you think about your code of ethics, the intention is not for it to be punitive. It doesn't have a disciplinary power. Its intention is to set out to the organization, what do we stand for? And it's one of the key fundamental tools or key fundamental pieces of ethics infrastructure for organizations on your ethics journey. Unlike a code of conduct, which you could, if you were a prosecutor in your discipline and inquiry in your workplace, you could use that document and say, this was set out as a code of conduct, the employee contravened that, therefore this would be a sanction. So the languages and the tone and the intent of the document is very different. Having said that, we do start to find of late that organizations are increasingly wanting to have a bit of a blend of the two, and that they would primarily start to find themselves starting with a tone around code of ethics, more aspirational, and then spelling out their behaviors or expected conducts related to their ethics. And almost we're starting to see that in some instances, the tone of codes of conducts are tending to be softened a little bit in these sort of combination or collaboration documents. So Barbara, I'll stop there, and Henro can come in now.
Thank you very much, Fatima, once again for the wonderful presentation. I think it was very clear and concise. Just to summarize, in Mozambique, basically, as we mentioned before, the Code of Ethics from the Institute of Directors is a principles-based code. But what we've seen in most of the public sector, the laws that are coming through are basically codes of conduct. They are basically related to the law that applies to the anti-corruption and whatsoever. So what we mainly see in the private sector, we have more codes of ethics in the principle base, specifically for those institutions that multinationals or internationally recognized companies whatsoever. So basically, this is what I wanted to share. But if there is any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you very much, Fatima. Barbara.
Thank you very much to both of you. If there are questions, please let us have them. We would really like to make the most of this opportunity and to really milk Hendra and Fatima of their expertise in this regard. I just have a question. I wanted to know, if you have a really good code of ethics, but you have a bad code of conduct, are you in the same sort of situation as if you have a good code of conduct and no code of ethics, or a bad code of ethics?
So, we talk a lot about the culture of organizations. And we say that if you have an organization with a strong or a firm or an established or a mature ethical culture, then the culture carries the organization. And that is the ethos within which the organization operates. So when we think about culture, we say, in its simplest form, we say that we talk about the culture of organizations is an ethical one when people do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because they're being watched or not because they're being driven by some sort of compliance imperative like a code of conduct. So if you have a strong ethical culture in which people intrinsically are motivated to do the right thing, then organizations would not be that dependent on their codes of conduct because they would be a stronger reliance on their culture. You do find that but it doesn't happen overnight. These things are built over time, and it's continuous efforts. But if you have bigger organizations, like typically in the public sector, for example, where the organizations are multifaceted, they have feet in different regions, they do tend to find that they need to have a strongly worded, firm, clear codes of conduct, because they create certainty and they create continuity, and the implementation is resting on the shoulders of so many. So a code of conduct is very important because it allows for consistency. And when you're thinking about a code of conduct, you are also thinking about managing consequences and creating consistent consequence management. So one really needs to be mindful of drawing that balance. And again, when you think about a code of ethics, you're looking at a short, sharp document. Something short, clear, concise, easy to remember, whereas a code of conduct generally tends to be a bit more of a lengthier, wordier document that might have certain specificities spelled out. So they do cater for two different ambits, as we've explained. I don't know if Hendra would like to add further.
No, that's fine, Fatima. Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got two interesting questions here. The first is from Susan Herbert. Is the code of ethics in an organization embraced in the mission, vision, and values, or should it be separately emphasized as the undergirding of the mission, vision, and values? And then a second question, how do you make the connection between your code of ethics and code of conduct? How should they kind of reflect one another? And that's from Javita Fazenda. Would you like to, one of you like to take those, or both of you make some comments?
Sure. Sorry, the first one, oh, the mission vision. Yeah. Okay, so we are seeing that organizations would state their mission, their vision, and then still have a code of conduct that departs of that same basis, and be able to say, this is who we are, this is what we're about. But there would be almost a golden thread that runs between those stated mission and vision, as well as then what is being stated in the code of ethics. Because the code of ethics is, and as I said in the definition, you can find that the code of ethics is typically expressed in your strategic intent and in your values. But we do find that organizations prefer to have a code of ethics that reiterates or move off the same basis. So they would say, these are my values, this is what I'm about, and then this is my code of ethics, which sets out what my expected standard of conduct would be. I'll pause for Hendra.
Hendra, would you like to comment on that, and then also refer to answer the second question, is how do you make that connection between the ethics code and the code of conduct, and should they kind of reflect one another?
Thank you very much, Barbara. Basically, what I wanted to add is, as it was mentioned before, the code of ethics should not only be a piece of paper that is used for marketing purposes of the company. So it has to be integrated in the entire process of the organization. So it should be included in the strategy, it should be included in the operational level, managerial level, whatsoever. So it is important so that they all combined documents that reflect what the company has defined as the values, as the principles, and as the ethical commitment, you know. Regarding the connection regarding code of ethics and codes of conduct, it was very well explained before. A code of ethics doesn't really stand for a punishment mean, but it is really to embrace and emphasize a certain culture within the organization. However, it is also important to reinforce that particular code of ethics that usually is done through the code of conduct and any other means. So from my practical experience, it mainly depends on where the ethics department is located within the company. If it's located in the legal department, for instance, which is not very recommended, they're usually more inclined to develop codes of conduct and develop in the spirit of the law, so that it it is someone that can be used for the disciplinary hearings and whatsoever. So if it is in a different department, such as compliance or even the ethics department, you know, the approach usually is different. Is mainly on the principle base and emphasizing the ethical culture within the organization. So Barbara, I think those will be my comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very good points. And I think it's crucial for organizations that are starting out. I know that not everybody is, but the point specifically for multinationals is that they have a very strong legal framework for operating outside of their head office country, but that the code of conduct and the code of ethics is something that has to take, and I'm going off at a bit of a tangent, but I think it's something we need to take cognizance of, is that it has a cultural bias as well. So that there's an understanding that how we operate in this particular country is based on our culture, on our values, and our approach to business, but that there is a universal, in the multinational context, a universal approach to saying, this is who we are and this is how we do things. And this is what we believe are valuable. So great comments there. Thank you so much. We're going on to the next session and the final session, which is why do we need a code of ethics in our organizations? So Fatima, over to you. And then Hendra, if you could just straight on after her, just go into your discussion as well.
Thank you. So when we think about why do we need a code of ethics in our organization, as the Ethics Institute, we locate our thinking around the ethics management framework, which is a framework which has been conceptualized by the Ethics Institute. And it provides us with a framework within which we can have this discussion around the management of ethics, about building an ethical culture, around ethical leadership within our organizations. This ethics management framework, which I'll share with you shortly, also sits at the heart of the thinking around King 4, around ethics and ethical leadership and the notion of ethics management. So if you're looking at this picture in front of you, you'll notice that the words culture appear almost on the outsides of the picture. And we say that, how do we impact on the culture of our organization such that we arrive at an ethical culture in our organization? So a culture whereby people do the right thing, whether they're being watched or they're not being watched, as I mentioned earlier. And in what the ethics management framework does is it provides us with I'm repeating the word framework, sorry, but it provides us with a word framework within which we can navigate coming to that outcome. So we talk about achieving of an ethical culture as an outcome. And we say that what you need first and foremost is you need leadership commitment. So you need leadership within your organization, whatever the manifestation of leadership looks like in your particular context. It could be a combination of board or political level plus administrative level, whatever, and the different levels of administrative leadership within your organization. But you need the leaders in your organization to be visibly, audibly, authentically committed to embarking on an ethics journey within your organization, to understand what it means to be on an ethics journey, to understand the importance of your organization being an ethical one, as well as what it means to have an ethical culture and how do you get there. So first and foremost, you need leadership commitment, and that takes work and effort to get your leadership on board. Then you need to have appropriate governance structures in place to exercise oversight over, are we building an ethical culture within our organization? So if you have to think about the context of a private sector company and that has a board, and the social and ethics committee, as an illustration of that point, would be the board committee delegated by the board to play that oversight role over, are we building an ethical culture within our organizations? So if we go back to King and we think about King 4, Principle 1 of King talks a lot about ethical leadership. It says that when we come together and we govern individually and collectively, we should display ethical leadership. And the second principle of King talks about the governance of ethics. And it says that when we govern, we should govern within our organization to support and exercise oversight over the building of ethical culture. Now, for the purposes of our conversation, when we talk about why do our organizations need codes of ethics, I want to focus us onto the center, which is the notion of ethics management itself. The framework says that when we've got the leadership commitment and the governance structures in place, we need to manage the ethics within our organizations. But how do you manage? Where do you start? Can you manage something if you don't know what you're managing? And what the framework says is, first and foremost, so the framework goes off to unpack what does ethics management look like. So the first thing that you would do is undertake something called an ethics risk assessment. And that is a process, as the Ethics Institute, we've developed tools, quantitative surveys through which this would be done. And that's done with the staff. It's an independent survey that is done with your staff, informed first through a series of interactions to understand your organization better. And then you develop a survey that then looks, which is administered to your staff, and they complete anonymously, often electronically, and sent back for collation. The output of that is that you get an understanding in your organization through the eyes of your employees around what are the things that undermine our organization from being ethical. So what are the risks to our organizations from an ethics perspective, as well as what are the opportunities for us as an organization from an ethics perspective. So that ethics risk assessment gives you an eye in terms of both the ethics risk as well as the ethics opportunities within your organization. And you would get something called an ethics risk profile. And that gives you something tangible to work with to understand your organization. And once you have that, you can move to the next part, which is almost like holding up a mirror. It's a conversation that says, the ethics risk profile is saying, this is who you are as an organization. These are the things in our context that are undermining us from being ethical. What is the sort of ethical organization do we want to be? Who do we want to be? What do we want to be known as? What is our ethics vision? And then after that question, how are we going to get there? What are the key things we're going to focus on? Having understood our risks and opportunities, what are we going to focus on to get to that vision? So that defines what your ethics strategy is. And generally it's accompanied by an implementation plan that would then talk to how and who and what needs to be done. Because we say that ethics is everybody's business. It's not just the business of the ethics office. So the ethics strategy and implementation plan give you a good guidance in terms of how you're going to turn the ship within your organization in your endeavor to move towards an ethical organization. And then do you come to your ethics code and policies? Because now you've understood your context. You've understood what undermines us. You've understood also what good looks like in our organization. And now you're firmly in a position to be able to go and look at your context within your organization and be able to say, what does an ethics code look like in my organization? Because I have an understanding of my risks, I have an understanding of my opportunities. And once I've used that as a basis to define my ethics code, it's also an opportunity for me to look at my ethics related policies. All my policies that are related to issues of ethics, so conflicts of interest, HR, etc., procurement, etc., and be able to do a stock take and say, are we aligned? Are we talking the same language? Are there gaps? Is there consistency between what my ethics strategy and my vision is and my code of ethics and my policies? Are there things we need to fix? Are there things we don't have? And you would also look at your code of conduct. I saw one of the questions earlier saying, are we being consistent? Are we saying the same thing? Are we sending mixed messages or being consistent? So this is an opportunity almost to take stock and realign, as well as to set out your code of ethics if you don't have one. And once you've done that, the organization is then in a firm position to go out to the next step. And when we think about institutionalization, that's what we commonly call making ethics real. Now you can go out to your organization and you can go out to your staff and you can conduct training and you can conduct awareness raising and you can work with different parts of your organization because you have a firm understanding of what are the risks, what are the opportunities, where we're heading, how we're going to get there. You've set out your code of ethics and you've checked your policies and made sure that you're aligned. Barbara, I'll stop there for the purposes of this conversation. I'll stop there and let Hendro take over.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Basically, what we'd like to emphasize is that the values that were mentioned in the triangle are basically those who were mentioned in the code of ethics. As you may imagine, we all have different experiences, different background. We come from different countries, so it is important to have a clear information of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable in an institution, in an organization. So that's why we need a code of ethics, a document that clarifies exactly what are the values of that particular institution. Because as you may know, we all have our own values, and we acquire them from the environment that we were brought to, that from our work experience, from church, from education, and whatsoever. So it is really, really important to have some common ground, especially for institutions like ours that have an international affiliation. You know, that also requires to some intent to see what are the practices that are adaptable to our reality, and what it's local culture that can be included in that particular document, so that it can somehow reflect the values not only of the organization, but of the country that the country is of the country that the organization is also a part of. Nevertheless, it is also important to mention that a code of ethics, it also allows us to provide the values and other related information in a very clear and understanding language, so that senior management, but also the other employees are able to understand and are able to embrace that particular document. It is also important so that we can have a tool that we can share not only with internal but external stakeholders, but it also a tool that can be used to benchmark with other organizations within the country, but also internationally. For instance, as OCOM, our code of ethics was used as a form of evaluation to be accredited for the Pan-African Federation of Accountants and the International Federation of Accountants. So it is very, very important, not only to show that you are walking the talk, but to show that that talk is in paper, and somehow that talk is reinforced and is implemented. So I believe, summarizing that, that's why it is very, very important to have a code of ethics. Thank you very much, Fatima. Barbara?
We've got some very interesting questions here. Carmen Malaweni asks, help me please to understand how to perform a ethics risk assessment, because I'm more familiar with safety risk assessment. And then some sort of big picture questions from Mr. Variz. Are there any stats or metrics on the social and economic impact of ethics management? And what is the influence of the Ethics Institute throughout Africa, namely Western Africa? So those aren't directly to do with the content. So I think let's just answer Carmen's question first, and then we can go on to Mr. Variz's questions, which really go to the impact of ethics management on the continent.
Okay. I'd like to encourage Carmen to attend our Ethics Officer Certification Program, because a part of a module on our 5-day Ethics Officer Certificate, it's now online, so it's the modality has changed, but our Ethics Officer Certification Program provides training on how to conduct an ethics risk assessment, amongst other things. And it kind of puts all of that in perspective in terms of the broader ethics management picture. But in summary, how, and it's different from, as you're saying, a safety risk assessment, because what you're looking for in an ethics risk assessment is you're trying to understand, in my context, in my organization, what do my employees think are the things that are happening here that are undermining my organization from being an ethical organization. And we typically, the instrument or the tool or the categories would look at what are the risks to my ethical culture, what are my levels of ethics awareness, within my organization. So how much do my employees know? How much don't they know? And what are the behaviors that sit within my organization? So within that, you get quite a good understanding of what your employees think about your organization, both from a risk perspective as well as an opportunities perspective. And just to say that it's not just a quantitative process, it is generally preceded by a qualitative process where you first understand what is the organization, what makes it tick, what are the concerns of key voices within the organization, and you use that as a basis to develop a tool that is then administered to within your institution. And maybe I can just share an experience. In South Africa, we have some organizations where employees don't have access to computers. So we do it both as a paper-based survey as well as an electronic survey, so that you are then making sure that you're able to access your employees more widely and not just in limited form for those that only have access to computers. I'll stop there, Barbara.
Okay. Hendro, have you got anything to add?
No, Barbara, but I would like to move to the next question, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Okay. About the question regarding the stats and metrics on social and economic impact of ethics management. There are a variety of tools, but I believe that Barbara later on will emphasize on some of them. In Mozambique, we have a sort of project called Anti-Corruption Index. That is a document that has been developed from some civil society organization that wishes to, somehow emphasize and give some stats on which companies and which public sector or departments are more ethical than others. And somehow we will try to develop a tool to inform on the impact of the unethical behavior in the Mozambican economy. I believe on the internet there is a fair amount of information that is available telling how much losses Africa has had through corruption, and some countries somehow mentioned in those particular documents, like the corruption index and whatsoever. But particularly in Mozambique, we have that particular project, and we have a transparency index project that is being developed by OCAM and its partner that wishes to somehow promote those companies who are implementing ethics, and they're somehow embracing and developing not their own institution, but also promoting their own communities, the suppliers, and the government as well, to embrace the ethical practices. So basically, this is what I wanted to share, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to add to that some of the information that I sourced from World Bank reports is that, and this is a quote that I've used in some of my presentations too, the average income in countries with a high level of corruption is about a third of that of countries with a low level of corruption. So there's a big difference. And then something that really caught my eye is that the infant mortality rate in countries with high levels of corruption is about 3 times higher, and the literacy rate about 25% lower. So really what it's saying is that the influence of corruption is dire. And we see it specifically in African countries, where the cycle of poverty is almost impossible to break out of, because the poor have no access to the reporting mechanisms, to the ability to create economic livelihoods without acting in ways that compromise their integrity. And so they're actually the ones that come off the worst. So Mr. Variz, we can perhaps give you, if you could email the coalition, we could provide you with some information on that. In terms of West Africa, I know the TEI is running programs in Ghana with training and providing access to considerable input on training for ethics officers, for building capacity. And if Celia would like to add anything on that, she'd be welcome. We do have some time.
We are working on initiatives in Ghana, West Africa area. At the moment, we mostly focused on our supply chains of large corporations. And we're doing an ethically aware supplier induction training program, whereby we capacitate the suppliers to large companies with the necessary knowledge on the international expectations surrounding ethics. It is based on the United Nations Global Compact pillars, doing business with integrity, treating employees fairly, your social impact, as well as then environmental impact of your small and medium enterprise. So that has been going strong. We've done other projects as well, and when Dion is on the call later, maybe he can also speak to previous experiences that or previous projects that we've done in that area. We've also worked, in Nigeria and a couple of other countries. So our program right now is running in Ethiopia, Ghana, Benin. So the whole area on that side, we're going even as far as Guinea-Bissau. So we're doing the ethically aware supply induction program there right now. Thank you for the opportunity, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Celia. That's great. So is the role of HR, is it the role of HR to do the ethics risk assessment? Fatima, would you like to answer that?
Sure. So the whole ethics management process is managed by your ethics office, or the custodians of your ethics process within your organization if you don't have an ethics office established. It is advisable that the ethics risk assessment be done independently, and most organizations would commission an independent service provider to conduct that ethics assessment, a risk assessment, to be able to get the independence of perspective and also to ensure the integrity of the process. So one needs to make a distinction between the commissioning of it and the conducting of it. And what we do see is in organizations, many organizations that we work with don't put ethics in HR. They tend to keep them quite clearly separated because often there are lots of ethical issues that are sitting in HR, and so many organizations, and perhaps that's a conversation for another day, where does one locate the ethics office? But you do tend to find that there would be either the ethics office or custodians of the ethics process within the organization would tend to commission the ethics risk assessment through independent service providers who would be able to conduct the process and come back with an ethics risk profile report and present it back to the organization in terms of what the findings of that were.
Excellent, thank you. And this is a very interesting question from Idris Yusuf. In your experience, number one, what are the biggest risks that companies in Southern Africa face? And two, how do they differ from the rest of the world? And Henro, can we start with you? And then Fatima, if you've got anything to add.
Well, Barbara, from our experience here in Mozambique, the biggest ethical risk that we've found so far is conflict of interest. Unfortunately, this is very common in our country. You see a senior official of a company signing a contract with his brother, with his sister, with his son, whatsoever. So this is a very common practice that we've found so far. Comparing with the rest of the world, unfortunately, I don't have the right tools so far. Perhaps Fatima can support us, but basically what we have seen so far is conflict of interest in Mozambique. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fatima?
Yeah, so I can reflect a little bit on the public sector. I mean, we see a lot in terms of, we commission a public sector ethics survey, and we drew, which has enabled us to now start to draw some benchmarks, because we have a maiden survey and a subsequent survey, and we see some of the key or major ethics risk are things that relate to some form of abuse of power, something related to leadership commitment, and the two often could be interlinked. And in the municipal context, because of the nature of the state in South Africa, we do tend to see an element of political interference in that particular level, but not in the other two levels of the state. We also have issues related to conflicts of interest, and then often there are issues in the basket of what we call inconsistency in consequence management. So it's not about needing more policies, but it's more about the fact that they are being inconsistently applied, and then the impact of that. We also see related to conflicts of interest, then the sort of related would be nepotism, recruitment interference, those sort of aspects. And then we tend to find what we commonly call counterproductive employee behavior, where you see employees physically being present at work, but being disengaged or disinvested. And it could be because of low morale or things like that. So it could be things like abuse of time and things related to that. So those would be some of the kind of more prominent risks that we tend to find in the public sector ethics survey that we've conducted. Yeah,
excellent. I think we all have some sort of experience of these very common problems. And I think what's crucial about this discussion today is that we've said quite clearly that the code of conduct is not sufficient to deal with the magnitude of some of the issues, because some of the issues become grey when there isn't a code of ethics. So excellent input, thank you so much. A couple of comments here. I think that the code of ethics are rules to follow for the success of any business. For example, you should not receive any form of tip. I think that's clearly something that happens often, and which, we've got a few minutes here, but I think this actually raises quite an important issue, is that quite often, for appreciation's sake, people might provide gifts and money as appreciation for a job done. How should we receive those in terms of or what should a code of ethics say about things like that? Yes.
So I want to slightly disagree around rules to follow, because a code of ethics is not really about rules to follow. If one had to think about a code of ethics, it's really aspirational. It's about who we are. So we're about honesty, we're about trust, we're about transparency, we're about accountability. And what does that mean in our context? So we often use or refer to the example of Johnson & Johnson. In their case, they developed their code of ethics many years back. My memory fails me, but I think it was roughly in the 60s. And that document, which they called the Credo, really explained who they are, what sort of organization they're about. And they prioritize their patients, and they prioritize their staff, and they prioritize healthcare and their communities. And that Credo has stood the test of time, and with minor adaptations still exists today. And it informs the basis on which Johnson & Johnson conducts itself as an organization, from the way in which its employees conduct themselves to the way in which the organization makes decisions. So it's not really about a rule as such. It's more about an aspiration or a sentiment about who we are and what we're about, and that gets translated. Generally, if you look at codes of ethics, what you're tending to find is that if it has a value, it can be potentially unpacked into a behavior to make it more real, so that people can understand, what does it mean for me if I'm sitting at this job, or what does it mean for me if I'm sitting at that job? So you want to try and make it as real as possible, and that doesn't necessarily have to sit in the code itself. So the code would be a short, sharp document, but you would look to be able to expand it or illustrate it so that you make it real and people are able to really relate to it and understand it. So if I can take one other example, you'll see, like in the banks in South Africa, what you're starting to find is they opting for a lot of combination documents where they will, because of their context being highly regulated, they'll take the tone of the regulatory context, but combine it with some sort of context around who we are and what we're about. And increasingly, you're starting to find that organizations are opting for that sort of approach where they can tackle both the conduct issues and the aspirational issues in one sort of hybrid or merged document. And that then brings the conversation about what is the purpose of a code of ethics? What do we want? We need to be quite clear about what we want. Because if we're clear about what we want and what the purpose of the document is, it then informs the subsequent questions about how do we design it? How do we consult on it? What do we write? What is the tone? What is the content? But the clarity around purpose is critical.
Right.
And there's no real one size fits all approach. It's about the sentiment of what a code of ethics is and the organization understanding what is its ethics risk and opportunities, what is its ethics strategy and implementation plan, and then using that as a basis to be able to define a code of ethics that best suits its context. I'll stop there, Barbara.
Right. Thank you so much. Hendro, would you like to add to that?
Yes, Barbara. First of all, I would like to comment on the question regarding HR. I've received a private message. Basically, what I wanted to emphasize is that what Fatima was saying, it is very, very important if an external service provider can conduct that particular survey. However, if that is not possible, we should look for a department that has a sort of independence within the organization to conduct that particular risk assessment. From our experience, usually that department is the compliance department or either the internal control department, internal audit, internal control, whatsoever. So those are the most common departments to conduct the ethical risk assessment within the organization. The other question that was raised regarding gifts and hospitality, although we don't have a survey regarding gifts and hospitality in Mozambique, from our experience, we've seen that, especially in the public sector, that is the biggest risk so far. And what has been happening in the private sector, usually in the companies, they have a thing called a gift register, and there's a policy that is defined whether in the code of ethics or in other sorts of document that stipulate what's the maximum amount of gifts that a certain employee can accept, whether it is $50, $10, 1,000 met, 2,000 met, whatsoever. So any other sort of gift and hospitality should be communicated to the ethics officer, and a approval should be granted before accepting or not. And there are some gifts and hospitality are usually defined as not to be accepted above a certain amount. So that implies that immediately when you are informed about it, you have to decline. So basically, this is what we've seen in the private sector. Thank you very much, Barbara.
No, thank you very much. Fatima, would you like to add to that?
I just wanted to say, just to remind, go back to thinking about the framework. So we talk about a code of ethics as being a short, sharp, clear document that is aspirational, that is intentional, that talks about who we are and what we're about. But if you think back to the framework, a code of ethics is accompanied by a series of ethics-related policies. And that would be the place in which one would almost, if I can use the word regulate or specify or create clarity around things like conflict of interest, around gifts, around extra remunerative work, around. So again, it brings us back, and perhaps that's a separate conversation about how does one draft these documents, where do they hook into each other, how does one develop that kind of ethics infrastructure, because one needs to see that as part of a puzzle, and how do they all fit in. So your code of ethics is almost the center that says, as I've mentioned when we started, it's our code that set out who we are, what we're about, what does good look like, and then it tends to be accompanied by a series of policies that that would create that clarity, that would navigate the gray areas. So we must anticipate that there will be situations in our organization. People are going to be conflicted. They're going to receive gifts. They are going to want to do. So the more proactive we are in anticipating and setting out policies and giving clarity. If this is going to happen, you go here. This is the form you fill out. This is who you speak to. Then we regulate those in other pieces that hook onto that code of ethics.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's a frame to bear in mind.
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue because it creates a lot of conflict for people when they're on the receiving end. I know that some companies have an absolutely black and white approach. You just don't take them, end of story. But that is also can be misconstrued. And so, yeah, it's treacherous territory in a way. But I think what you've said is that the combination of the code of ethics and specific policies really does guide that. Thank you so much. I'm going to finish off these questions with a comment from Javita, which says, from my experience, whenever we can explain the obligations arising from a code of conduct in value terms, relating legal obligations to the values they are trying to protect, it makes it easier for the receiver to understand and to promote compliance. I think that's a very valuable comment. Thanks, Javita. So that being the sum of questions, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome to the webinar and to the masterclass Professor Dion Rousseau, who is the CEO of the Ethics Institute. And he has the pleasure of launching for us the Portuguese version of the Code of Ethics Handbook. Over to you, Dion.
Thanks, Barbara, and a very good morning to you and also to our panelists. Excellent inputs, Hindro and Fatima. Thank you very much for what you have done. Okay, so let me start by some background to the Coalition for Organizational Integrity. And this masterclass, of course, fits into the bigger objectives of this Coalition for Organizational Integrity in Mozambique, where individual companies sign up to join the coalition. And there are a few very specific objectives that are being pursued in this coalition. Number one, to develop ethics management capacity and resources within the coalition. Number two, to assess ethics management capacity and also organizational ethical culture of coalition members. The third objective is to strengthen the commitment to business integrity of professionals, different professional bodies within the coalition. And finally, to provide an ethics and anti-corruption training program for small and medium enterprise suppliers to the members of the coalition. And all of this is made possible with the financial support of the Siemens Integrity Initiative. But what I would like to focus on this morning, and you already have seen a part of that in action, is that one of the objectives is to develop ethics management capacity. And these masterclasses, the first of which you have participated in this morning, is there as one of the tools to build ethics management capacity. But you can see it's also about developing resources, knowledge resources, other resources that members of the coalition can use in their attempts to manage ethics in their respective organizations. Now, at the Ethics Institute, we already developed a lot of resources, and all of these resources are freely available. So any member of the coalition are more than welcome to go to our website and download any of these resources. You can see it's, for example, about how do you report on ethics to management, but also to the board. There was an earlier question on how to conduct an ethics risk assessment. Well, there is the ethics risk handbook. There were also already conversations about the relationship between ethics and compliance. This specific book deals with that interface. Here is the Ethics Office Handbook, which provide guidance on how to set up an ethics office or ethics management function in an organization. Here's a book on how to manage whistleblowing in organizations. And of course, very relevant for today is the Code of Ethics Handbook. Now, all of these resources as I said, is freely available. You just go to the website of the Ethics Institute, tei.org.za, and you will find all these resources there. Now, this morning, there is a new milestone in the development of these resources, and we are extremely proud to announce the launch of the first handbook in Portuguese, and specifically the one dealing with the topic of this morning's masterclass, Codes of Ethics. Codes of Ethics in the generic sense of the word. In other words, the book goes into both codes of ethics, more the value-based aspirational codes, as well as codes of conduct, which is much more directional. And once again, the translation publication of this handbook is once again made possible by the Siemens Integrity Initiative. But we would like to extend a special word of thanks to Jovita Matos Fazenda for proofreading the Portuguese translation of the book. And the book is now available on the website of the coalition. So if you go to that link, coi.org.mz/handbooks, you will find your copy, and we really encourage you to download a copy of this handbook and put the handbook to good use. Because ultimately, I think it is important for us to realize that a code of ethics is just words on paper. In other words, once we have drafted and published a code, what we have is words on paper. And what matters now is that we must make these words on paper a living document. But that would not happen automatically. Certain things need to be done. And it really starts with the proper design and the intelligent design of a code so that it becomes a product that is easy to read, easy to understand, easy to use. And part of the handbook deals specifically with that. What should go into one's thinking when you are drafting a code of ethics? Then, once you have a code, a beautiful code, well drafted, it only works if people are familiar with the content of the code. And that is why, as Hendro and Fatima both indicated, it is so important to create opportunities where people can become familiar with the content of the code. Codes only work if everyone in the organization senses that this document is important. This is, in fact, our moral constitution. And that message only gets through if we have visible but also audible leadership support. If leaders are seen to support the code and are serious to enforce it on all levels of the organization. And then, as we have seen also in the conversation, it's about consistent application. There's nothing that undermines the legitimacy of a code, such as when there is inconsistent application. In other words, if the code and the content of the code only applies to the small fishes in the organization and not also to the big fishes. It is absolutely important that there must be consistency in application of the content of the code across all levels of the hierarchy of the organization. And then, as you've also heard, it is important to understand that the code is just one element of a much bigger ecosystem of governance and management of ethics, as we've also indicated to you in that governance of ethics framework, where you can see that the code of ethics and the ethics policies is just but one element of a much bigger ecosystem of governance and management of ethics. And therefore, very important to understand that ultimately it is the words and the actions of people that will give the code legitimacy and that will give it life. That is what ultimately turns words on paper into a living document that lives in the hearts and minds of people. I really trust that that you will have access to this book as soon as you can, that you download your copy, that you make full use of it. And it is a handbook. It is something that you can keep on your desk, and whenever you have questions about various aspects of the design and the implementation of codes and of ethics, you have it at hand and you can use it. Thank you for this opportunity, Barbara, and I want to wish everyone involved in this masterclass only the very best for the next versions of this masterclass and also other masterclasses that are still coming up. Thank you, Barbara.
So we've come to the end of a very meaningful, detailed and insightful masterclass, and I'm very grateful, thanks to Hendro and Fatima, for your valuable insights and your contributions. We're immensely grateful. I know that it's time consuming. We've had prep meetings, you've been putting presentations together, and it's really been a wonderful and certainly an important time for me to just have all of this information reinforced. And also our thanks to you, Dion, for launching the Code of Ethics Handbook in Portuguese. Well, in English, but you know what I mean. We will be sending the link for the recording plus the presentations in the next day or two. But really what I'd like to say to you is two very important things to remember. We've got 2 follow-up sessions. The second session of the Code of Ethics Masterclass happens on the 10th of December and will deal with the drafting of the Code of Ethics. And the third session on the 21st of January, which will deal with implementing the Code of Ethics. And for those of you who are able to attend all 3, we will be providing you with a very nice certificate of attendance, because I think it's important that your organizations know that you've committed to this time and that you're able to provide them with the support that the coalition can provide. Again, thank you to our delegates. We really appreciate you attending the masterclass. Without you, we would have just had a lovely little discussion. And thank you for your awesome questions. And we look forward to seeing you on the 10th of December. Again, thank you, Fatima. Thank you, Hendro, and all the best. Thank you, Dion.